Fusion Patrol is a listener-supported podcast. Find out how you can help support us at patreon.com/Fusion Patrol. This is the Fusion Patrol podcast. Each week, we look at a different science fiction TV episode or movie and overanalyze it to within an inch of its life. Welcome to the discussion. Hello and welcome to another episode of Fusion Patrol. I'm Eugene.
And I'm Simon.
And tonight we're looking at the Doomwatch episode, Herr Trigger. And I have to say, when I first heard the name of this episode, I thought it was Herr Trigger, and I thought it was about a Nazi German munitions expert. But
I think that joke was done in a lower low.
It probably was. It probably was. I never watched the show. Well, I watched one episode and I thought, yeah, no. Episode synopsis. For reasons never adequately explained, Dr. Anne Tarrant is visiting the Weather Oak Maximum Security Medical Research Facility, where she is given demonstrations of a new cutting-edge technological procedure being tested on psychiatric patients. The director, Dr. Hetherington, and lead psychiatrist, Dr. McEwen, are very proud of their technological marvel, electronically stimulating the pleasure centers of the human brain to modify undesirable behavior. Dr. Tarrant is horrified by the obscene abomination. She uses her insider's track to Quist to try to get him to look into it, but he insists that it doesn't sound so bad, and anyway, it is absolutely not within Doomwatch's remit. Hetherington visits the minister. His treatment is 100% successful, and he's facing a lot of kickback from old-school Freudian psychiatrists who are threatened by his new no-therapy treatment. There's an appropriations meeting coming up next week, and his technique could save immense amounts of money to the healthcare system. We wouldn't want anything to go wrong. What could go wrong? Oh, did I mention one of those old-school Freudians stopped by my facility and didn't like what she saw? It was Dr. Anne Tarrant. The minister's face is priceless. Soon, he's on the phone to Quist just to let him know he's thinking about him. And we wouldn't want any setbacks to Dr. Hetherington's work. Now, Quist is interested. Meanwhile, Dr. Tarrant is talking with Dr. McEwen. She wants to evaluate his patient, Mr. Beavis, a violent sociopath cured by his technique. Beavis has been fitted with radio receivers. When his brain starts to exhibit violent patterns, he is pacified by the computer. Beavis is eager to talk with Dr. Tarrant. He's very proud of his cure. Tarrant takes him for a walk on the grounds and pushes him about his background. He doesn't want to talk about it, but rather wants to talk about his treatment. She continues to push, and he gets violent. Back in the control room, they watch as the computer pacifies him. Unknown to them in the struggle, he was disconnected from the receiver. Dr. Tarrant falls and hits her head, and Beavis, panicked, runs to escape. Later, Beavis rips the remaining equipment off and throws it away, finds a small farmhouse and takes a woman and her children hostage at shotgun point. He is beginning to confuse the woman with his wife, whom he murdered. He is waiting for Dr. McEwen. When McEwen arrives, Beavis releases the hostages in exchange for McEwen coming into the house with him. While Quist, Tarrant, and the police wait outside, they hear the sound of a shotgun. McEwen comes out. Beavis killed himself with a shotgun blast to the heart. He also left a final will, leaving his brain to Dr. McEwen so that he can figure out why he went wrong. So, Herr Trigger, kind of actually, I felt it was a little bit of a throwback Doomwatch episode.
You mean because
here.
it's not about pollution?
It's not about pollution. Doomwatch, Quist is not the slightest bit concerned about this technological marvel that's going on. You know, and besides that, it's not part of Doomwatch's job anyway, so let's just leave that one alone. And it also does have kind of that ethical issue about what we could do. It's kind of like in the dark, where what can we do with technology and what are the implications for the for the human race along the way. So, what did you think of this episode?
Well, I agree. It has some of those themes. I mean, I quite enjoyed the episode. It seems to me it's another well constructed episode. So it feels much more like, while back in series 1 it was kind of quite uneven, and then in series 2 where you got some episodes of just absolute genius, it feels like from what we're glimpsing of season 3, there's a quite well-oiled machine turning out thrillers that have some sort of techno or futuristic basis. And obviously the thing here is I'm trying to work out what the thing actually is, because it struck me when I was mulling this over since watching it, that the kind of the ethical issue that they're digging into, the kind of doom they're watching, I guess, is that the brain is being controlled by electronics. It's there's an electronic solution that is regulating the brain, in other words.
Uh-huh.
And the issue with this is framed in terms of it not really providing a cure as such, whatever that means. It's essentially providing a way of controlling the kind of psychopathic tendencies, if you like. Would this episode have been any different if, rather than electronic regulation of the brain, it had been a chemical regulation of the brain?
So when I watched this episode, I was struck, well, one, by the question is this really a bad thing? But the second thing that stands out to me is I believe that Anne Tarrant is a psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
I believe she has been explicitly called a psychiatrist. But in modern parlance, a psychiatrist is a pill pusher and a psychologist is a therapist. At least that is my experience with at least the American healthcare system. And you see a psychiatrist for chemical regulation in conjunction with a psychologist for therapy. And Anne seems to be taking no, therapy is the answer. And in fact, because they keep referring it to Freudian, which is basically outdated anyway, I don't think they refer to psychologists as Freudian anymore. I don't think anybody falls in that camp. It's so outdated. It may be the foundation that they were built upon, but it has progressed so much from that time that it's really hard to differentiate the archaic world that we're looking at. Because, yeah, you're right. Would they be poo-pooing chemical treatment? I think they would. I think there is a little bit of a discussion from Hetherington about that, but I get the distinct impression that the therapists are clearly against that too. And this is just a carry on from that. And so we are talking about the people who are trying to delve into the mind and trying to fix the problem through therapy, and which they see as a cure, versus the people who are trying to make it so that you can be a functional person through chemical modification. And we now know that a lot of problems that people have are chemical imbalances. So there is, and there is, to this day, there is a stigma about, taking your meds for having psychological issues. And some people still see that as a failing. And it isn't, right?
Certainly isn't. Well, no, because you wouldn't think it was a failing if you had physical health issues. You wouldn't
Correct.
go, well, I'm not going to. It's a failing for me to take my medication for that. But just because it's a mental health issue, it would be a failing to take the medication. Although
exactly.
I agree with you that stigma is around, and there's no doubt about that.
Oh, it's real, but there shouldn't. I mean, it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
If I guess there is. All right, I'll try to play the devil's advocate. There is potentially the argument, that says if you can be treated, then you don't need to be cured, right? And then there's that whole thing is about whether or not doctors are there to cure you or whether doctors are there to prolong your treatment so they continue to get a revenue stream. But I don't subscribe to that theory. I mean, if that's what it takes, I don't know that I'm convinced that therapy has ever cured people.
I wouldn't go that far. I think there's a much more nuanced take on this, which is that if you're a medical doctor, the terminology is going to be interesting here. I don't recognise the distinction you made between psychiatry and psychology. I'm not an expert in it, but I think there may be slight differences between the terminology on your side of the pond and ours.
Could be. It could be.
And that may extend to physicians of physical health. But so let me put it this way: if you're a medic who is concerned with someone's physical health, then you may have options for treating them. One of which may be a long-term dependence on medication, and one of them, in order essentially to treat the symptoms of some underlying problem, and the other may be to treat the underlying problem in order to rid yourself even the need of having to take the long-term treatment. And there isn't necessarily a simple answer to one always being better than the other. It depends on the particulars of the situation, because whatever you do, there will be side effects and costs associated with the choice you make. And I think that a mature approach to mental health would be to recognize that the same thing applies. And no one approach is always going to be better than the other. The problem is people thinking that, one is inherently better than the other.
Yeah, so I'm in a way, I'm very much not on Anne's side in this argument. But where I am, I mean, where I do think that there's some wiggle room on this is I'm concerned about the way that they do it.
Okay,
the bit about stimulating the pleasure centers of the brain, and she even brings up the possibility of what about addiction? And they go, we can condition them against that. But if you were a violent psychopath and you were under control, as Beavis was, and you got a big jolt of the joy juice every time you got violent, isn't that just possible that he might look for ways to get violent so that he could get the jolt? And that's the part that's kind of, I don't know if that's the right approach, but it doesn't intrinsically mean that electronically modifying the brain is a wrong approach. It's just that maybe that particular one sounds a little fraught with trouble.
Yes. Although, that obviously gets into the technical psychological specifics of how it works, which is somewhat glossed over, which is why I'm interested in the distinction, because I think that a lot of the kind of Doomwatch doom predictions have been interesting precisely because when we are sitting here from the vantage point of 50 years in the future, we can look at a load of them and go, my God, you were right. You were right on the money when most people weren't even thinking about this. And occasionally there's a miss in the sense of, that didn't really happen, or there's nothing like this. And I'm looking at this and thinking, well, essentially there is nothing like this if you consider it to be the specific technical application that they were employing, i.e. that it is an electronic solution. But if you consider it as chemical modification of the brain, actually, this is very much commonplace now and accepted. And so from that point of view, I am interested in what Anne Tarrant's perspective on this is, and in terms of whether, as a psychiatrist, she does, or as a psychiatrist in 1972, whether she does treat people using prescribing medication that would chemically alter their brain, because I don't know. Not only do I know very little about psychiatry in the present day, I don't know how it has changed and evolved over the last 50 years. But I do think that she is not necessarily portrayed as being on the right side of this argument. I think that's deliberate.
That's a good question. I don't know. I kind of get the impression that she's supposed to be portrayed as being on the right side of this argument, but that the argument is not 100% right and wrong. Because I think
maybe she's
at the end,
60% on the right side.
I think at the end, the scene where McEwen points out to Beavis, and I'm just going to say I've been calling him Beavis, but it sounds like they're saying Beavis. But when I saw the name written in the end credits, it looked like Beavis. So that could just be an American versus, I don't know. But anyway, Beavis, Beavis, Mr. Crazy Guy. Okay, maybe. Mr. Beavis, it could come out weird to me anyway. Neither there. When he has that scene where he says to him, yeah, but you didn't. You didn't kill the woman. You didn't.
Yeah.
Saying you did control yourself. It does imply that even though this therapy is not, or this treatment is not therapy, or that it is not meant to be, it's not meant to be a remedy. It's not meant to fix the problem. It's meant to ameliorate the problem. And somehow it actually has made a difference. And that this man's condition has actually improved under these tests. So that makes me think that, the writer is not unsympathetic to it.
No, I think McEwen is portrayed relatively sympathetically. I mean, I did wonder about the ending, because obviously we don't see what happens, and partly we don't see what happens is because think about what Mary Whitehouse would have said in 1972 if we'd seen Beavis's brains being splattered all over the walls. But there is also the question of what McEwen said to Beavis and whether the outcome is actually quite convenient for him, because it's sort of, it's not his brain splattered everywhere, because of course his brain is being left for medical examination. So it gets rid of his problem, and it gives him the essential, the research artifact that's going to help him in the future.
Well, I mean, okay, so for starters, we know that Beavis demanded the piece of paper from the woman long before McEwen got there. So Beavis had already committed to his course of action before McEwen arrived. He was going to kill himself. That's what he wrote. Point. So that was never in any question. We didn't know what he was writing, but, subsequently when he held up the note, he says this was his will and he left his brain to me. So we know that that's what he intended to do.
Well,
the reason they didn't show it,
McEwen's portrayal.
And I think the reason that we didn't see what happened is drama. It's far more interesting for the audience to be out there and hear the gunshot and think he murdered McEwen because he's a dangerous psychopath. So there's that. And then just to point on the technicality thing, I'm not an expert. I've never been an expert. I have fired shotguns before, I will say. And I do not think that it would be particularly easy for a person to shoot themselves in the heart with a shotgun, which he did say, which is
another reason I was wondering.
Propped it up against the wall, leaned his body against it, and pushed across to hit the trigger. But that was a little bit weird. But no, I don't think McEwen killed him. I don't think McEwen pushed it. I think that was what it was all about. And it's further sign that Beavis knew Beavis was in more control of himself than perhaps he had been prior to the treatment. He certainly seemed very vested in it. He certainly seemed very pleased with the treatment. And do we think that's genuine?
Yeah.
Do we think he really is? I'm really happy that I'm not running around killing people. This is fantastic. And not just because, hey, every once in a while I get a jolt of the joy juice and that's a lot of fun. which really his expression when he was pushed up against the window earlier in that episode was disturbing at best. A little drool would have just made that a bit worse, but it was. There is one other thing that made me think that the writer was definitely on Anne's side, and that was McEwan's conversation with Quist, where he was basically implying that, sure, right now we've got a human hooked up to a computer, and all it does is a little bit of feedback to regulate violent behavior, but we can go so much further with this. Man and computer, the augmented brain. And this was the first step towards a cyber interface. And he was implying that
Yes.
was down the road. So
direct dialogue between brain and computer.
Yeah. So it was, which has nothing at all to do with treatment of psychiatric patients, and everything to do about changing what it is to be a human being.
Well, it is, but then
theme.
the conclusion I came to about why this is different from chemical treatment, which I don't know whether I felt was something that was actually intended in the episode, but to me, it is an important distinction, was that the computer, the electronic part of the way the brain was being regulated was by a computer that was under someone else's control. It was like your psychiatric patient, certainly once they're sort of released into the community, decides to take their meds. I mean, it may be a condition of their release that they commit to, but whatever. There is some element there still of autonomy. And it would be possible to imagine an electronic solution where there were, particularly now, where there was some kind of microcomputer built into whatever the actual receptor was that Beavis was wearing. But that wasn't what we had here. What we had here was a computer that was external to him. And the point was made, and it's one of the first things that Quist said when he saw it, was that it's remote control. So what you've actually got here is the apparatus for remote controlling another human being. And the computer, and in particular that remote control, is under the operation of someone else. And so in a sense, what you've got here is very much like the plot of the Avengers episode Return of the Cybernauts, where you have the ability to take over, to for essentially a machine or someone remote controlling to control the body of someone else. And that is the potentially worrying part of it.
Right. And it's funny that they didn't play that up more. I didn't feel like that was laid out in typical Doomwatch fashion. They did at one point call these people like robots, but they never any point did somebody say, what if we had the minister wired up like this? And every time somebody came along and wanted Doomwatch to stop investigating something, they gave him a jolt.
That's
to control
the
him.
plot of a Neil Stevenson novel, I believe.
So I could. It's totally a valid concern, and it is very much a worry. But
it's not the worry that they go with. What the worry that they go with, which is partly why I come back to my original point about them being very adept at making a well-constructed thriller out of these things, is nothing inherent about the technology. It's just, what if it becomes unplugged, which is like a problem with the implementation that could be easily remedied in some way. It just gives you some kind of immediate drama to actually bring the episode to a climax.
Right. I think I'm going to take a slight aside here and say that we are also looking at 1972, and I have been trying to look up the treatment of chemical therapy, and not really. The stuff that is in action today, starting in the 80s, like Prozac.
Okay.
Invented in the 70s, but not even into operation until the 80s. And I'm not finding a lot prior to the 80s.
So actually, the episode was in some ways spot on. It was just that they picked electronic rather than chemical.
But he did mention chemical, so there must be something that I'm missing. I'm not finding a really great timeline here, but
it's probably pretty hard to research instantly while you're trying to podcast at the same time.
It's shockingly difficult, especially with my keyboard. Especially with my keyboard, which makes so much noise that you have to stealth type on it. But yeah, no. So it again, we are looking at a world that perhaps we can't even relate to. We can't set ourselves in the mind of going, what was it like at this point in time?
Yes, although I mean, I can imagine them without that. I mean, that was why the question immediately occurred to me whether the episode would be different if it were about chemical regulation rather than electronic regulation. Well, it didn't immediately occur to me, but that was where the thought came from. And
didn't they had electroshock therapy back then, though?
Well, I'm thinking One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was written in it was written in the 60s, wasn't it? Probably.
So could you imagine? Could you imagine Dr. Tarrant taking a position of no, it's therapy versus electroshock, and then I think it's pretty clear that we would be taking the side of the therapy.
Yeah, probably.
So it could be that the treatments to the brain were the physical treatments to the brain were so crude. Looking at this in 1972, that this seems more obvious.
Yeah. And it does seem quite appealing, and I think in some ways that is why they have to play up, but more than the fact that I think Anne Tarrant is being shown to be overly sympathetic, is they have to play up the disadvantages of this because it does seem too good to be true,
and then they miss the important disadvantages. Yeah.
And when they're talking about the disadvantage, they bring in, I think this is the minister talking about chlorination, fluoridation, and vaccination, and I heard that, and I was actually struggling to make the connection there. I mean, I understand the arguments that connect those because they're all public health measures that affect us all and benefit us all in the same way.
Like chlorinating chickens. Just depends on who your doctor is. Your health expert is.
I think there are ways of avoiding the downsides of unchlorinated, disease-ridden chicken that don't involve chlorinating disease-ridden chicken. Chlorinating water, on the other hand, has a massive benefit, and you can't do it for the individual. You have to do it for everyone. Same goes for vaccination, etc.
Fluoridation, yeah.
I can't see what the parallel is here.
Do you not see that the parallel is that in some instances, vaccination? I don't know. All right, I'll try to step back from the vax debate for a second. The chlorination and the fluoridation. Was there a significant population of people at the time who were opposed to it?
Yeah,
because I don't know. I mean, when I was a kid, we would get those health and films in school, and they were propaganda films. They were left over from the days of 50s and 60s propaganda films, and so. Fluoridating the water, it's the most amazing thing we've ever done to public health and saving your teeth. And so you believe that everybody was on board with it. But looking back now, that there's a huge pile of crackpots who are against it still. But the question is, how big was the pile of crackpots back then? And were they crackpots at the time because it was a new treatment? And that's our question here. Are the people looking at this treatment at that time and saying, this is a bad idea? Are Are they tomorrow's crackpots, or are they that day's clairvoyant seers of doom and bad ideas?
They're not necessarily they're not necessarily seers of things that are wrong, but there is an obvious concern when you are doing something where basically if you're adding something to the drinking water of the entire nation, if you don't know about what it is that is being added, and you have to assume there is general ignorance in the population at large, because we've had years and years and years to learn about this stuff, and also years and years and years to understand the safety of it and its benefits. But say they introduce something now into the drinking water for everyone that you or I knew nothing about, without knowing anything about it, would you go, that's a good thing or a bad thing? Or would, maybe that's the wrong question. Would you think that's maybe a worrying thing? That's maybe something that we oughtn't to rush into, particularly when you consider who the government is who is rushing into it. And that's not necessarily paranoia. That is just natural trepidation about doing something so radical and far-reaching when you're not absolutely 100% sure that the thing is safe and beneficial, which we can now say we are 100% sure about these things because hindsight is wonderful.
I don't know. I mean, when you posed that question, my thought was, my concern was not about the science of it, because you could check the science. I mean, obviously you're not an expert, but I mean, you should be able
and most people aren't,
to check you should be able to check the research and see that it is properly taken care of. But my absolute concern is that no, I would not trust anything that say the Trump government thought was a good idea to put into the water. But it's purely political. That's the interesting thing about having the minister in this, because all of this stuff is political. I mean, Doomwatch itself is, whether it wants to be or not, it is a political outfit. Its role is inherently political. It is seen by the scientists that it, air quotes, polices as being a political organization and an arm of the ministry, which, I think we've probably now established it is. So you can't, I think, judge these things purely on whether or not the science is right or wrong, particularly when you consider that the perspective that the general viewing audience might have had on this in 1972 is a very different one from the audience now in 2020. So do you think that, back to your fluoridation, vaccination, chlorination question, I could envision a very different view of that on this side of the pond than on that side of the pond. And here's why. It's very much clear to me that what Hetherington is proposing is that his therapy be adopted by the National Health and basically replacing or substantially diminishing therapy, which is expensive and long-term. So this is actually a decision of what, this is a decision about everyone in the country. It is like fluoridating the water. They are going to change what you can get for your health care for everyone in the country. That would not happen in the United States because of the way our system is all screwed up. But over there, sure. So
I don't think that is the primary benefit that he identifies. I think what he's talking about is the saving that you make on, yes, I guess we are talking about institutions that come under the health service rather than the prison service, but you're talking about the costs associated with long-term secure accommodation. These people are being committed, and his treatment is allowing them to be released, and obviously that is making huge savings. And I think this is the point where actually whole
They're talking about
dichotomy
long-term
between
therapy as well.
Well, I think
The cost of long-term therapy.
that is a false dichotomy, and I'm not clear whether the episode is guilty of perpetuating this. But you don't necessarily replace therapy with these treatments. Again, I can't help thinking of, switching to thinking about chemical regulation of the brain or whatever, but you don't go, well, this is one or the other. You actually go, there is some sort of a combination here because it is perhaps easier to make progress with therapy if you can control things at the same time, and you can, in particular, in Beavis's case, you could be released and continue to have some kind of support, but it would be much more beneficial to him because he would be re-engaging with society at the same time as receiving that.
I did get the impression they were talking about, we'll call it a false dichotomy, but yeah, I got the impression that they were like, this guy is going to be in therapy for 10, 20 years. He may never get better. He may never be able to get out, or he might, but it's going to take a long time. My treatment, he's going to be out and he's going to be a productive member of society. And bingo, bango, bongo. We're satellites we're going to put in orbit so we can control them from all over the planet. We forgot to mention that part was mentioned in this episode. And then, which I thought was very far reaching. I thought they were going to put an antenna on the radio tower, but, or post office tower, but instead, but okay, they were progressive. And I did get that impression. And there was something Hetherington said in the minister's office that made it sound like, I am saving you so much money on healthcare that this is, a lot of people are behind this. The health minister and everyone, we're in on it. So it is a public health. It is treated as a public health benefit as opposed to just a therapy that we're talking about whether or not it should be ever allowed. I think she was working on the assumption that it was going to be widespread very quickly.
So that question about satellites and radio masts and things just made me think, what happens when you wander out of range? And is that what Quist was going on about when he suddenly started talking about Dead Man's Handle? Because I didn't quite get it at the time.
I just thought that he was talking about the fact that if so you're in the case of a train, you're in control. You're holding the switch at all times, and if you pass out, you can't hold the switch. I assumed that he was talking about a person being in control of his own actions. You're fine, but it's an imprecise analogy. But when you start to lose control, then the switch kicks in because you're not holding back anymore. So that's where I thought
it's a strange analogy there, because the whole point of the Dead Man's Handle is that you're doing, there is some kind of intervention that is occurring when you're in control, when you're pulling on the handle. When you let go of it, it goes back to the status quo ante. The train is no longer being propelled in the case of a train. So what I was wondering was, and I don't think this has anything to do with what Quist was talking about actually, but if you built in, not exactly a Dead Man's Handle, but if you built in a device that meant that whilst you were in radio contact, then you were allowed a certain amount of control over your own brain. And as soon as you went out of radio contact, then it, I don't know, shut you down, lost consciousness or something, just as a kind of public safety measure. But it obviously that would be that would play straight into all of the concerns about civil liberties, etc., which is maybe the one area where I think I can actually see the connection with the vaccination and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm willing to forgive several things in this episode. One of which is the fact how easily Beavis was disconnected from the equipment.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is a very, very dangerous man. But he is being held in a maximum security prison or research facility, and he is an experiment. And so the prototype is not necessarily going to be what it would be like if they were to let him loose in the public. And so the fact that it was able to be knocked off in a brief struggle, all right, the prototype versus the production model, very different. I think they'd have to bore it into his brain and secure it so that it couldn't. But still, there's batteries, there's, deep tunnels, there's, all sorts of things that could cause problems with that program. But that was for the convenience of telling the story and showing what happens if it goes wrong. And I'll let it pass in this case, because it is just a test case. But
do you see any connection with Brian Hales wrote another Doomwatch, which was the one which was also set in a hospital and was also about a computer.
Was it the Iron Doctor?
Connected to the patients, indeed. And so in that one, it was about a computer being in control of the patients, although it was a little less nuanced than this one, I think.
I think that's a safe statement. It was a little less nuanced. Obviously, that's his thing.
Well, but is it? I mean, as far as Doctor Who is concerned, we know him for Ice Warriors and Peladon stories, which don't seem to have much connection with this kind of
the Archers. And I guess there isn't a whole lot there in either of those. So, but I guess given here you are, you're going to write for my show about technological or scientific dangers. Maybe he's got a concern there. I do want to bring one thing up. There is the scene towards the beginning where Anne is trying to interest Quist in this, and Quist is not at all interested. Quist is definitely saying, I don't know, this sounds like it might be a good deal. And apart from the fact that it's got nothing to do with Doomwatch, can you explain that to me? For starters, why has that got nothing to do with Doomwatch? It seems right up Doomwatch's alley. But hold on to that for a second. If you could explain that, but hang on to that explanation. He's like, it's got nothing to do with that. It's got nothing to do with us. It sounds like a good idea. And Tarrant says to him, what if it had been John Ridge? And then suddenly Quist gets that sort of, oh yeah, what if it had actually been a real human being that I knew or cared about? Does that also support this sort of, sure, on paper, it's a great idea and go ahead and do it to a bunch of other people. But once it hits close to home, suddenly people realize, no, I'm not so much in favor of that. Because, a lot of times people will be very selfish in that way. Sure, vaccinate all your kids. That way my kid won't get it and I don't have to give him vaccinations.
I don't know, because it didn't feel to me like it was especially in character with Quist, or at least the kind of previous Quist, the sort of single, rather irascible, quite authoritarian, in fact, extremely authoritarian. Although I don't know, he might still have some of that, but he definitely seems to have mellowed somewhat. And even in Public Enemy, he was very much like, oh, we've neglected this. We've been warned about it a couple of times. We should be doing something about it. We should have been doing something about it. And yet, when Tarrant brings something to him that, as you say, seems very much Doomwatch's area of work, he doesn't even make an excuse. He's brushing it off like he's gone native in the civil service, and he's just going, oh, can that be someone else's problem? I've got plenty of work to do. I just want to sit here and listen to your record player, darling.
Well, yeah, I didn't get his argument that said this was not Doomwatch. It felt Doomwatch to me.
Part of me wondered if it was a way that was contrived in order to mention John Ridge in this episode, because it seems to me like the interesting things going on with John Ridge, and I don't know exactly what precipitated this, but it feels like Simon Oates has decided that he doesn't want to be as committed to Doomwatch, the show, as he was when he was having to do every single episode. Bit like when David Duchovny left the X-Files, and
that was a bit disastrous. Yeah.
He obviously felt that he didn't want to commit as much of his time so that he was able to pursue other projects. But in the show, you got a big arc about, where is Mulder? And that was a kind of a story arc that actually revolved around Mulder, even though what it was actually revolving around was the absence of Mulder. And it almost feels like what's going on in Doomwatch Series 3 is that we get a little bit of John Ridge. So we've had a couple of episodes with John Ridge in, one of which had a lot of John Ridge in it. But the others seem to need to mention John Ridge to remind us that the John Ridge arc is still occurring and that, John Ridge is gone but not forgotten.
Yeah. I don't know if that pays off. And we probably will never find out.
We may not find out because it may be something that didn't make its way into the rest of the series. So until I'm very deliberately avoiding finding out anything about what happens from here on. So there may be stuff from the scripts that we can that is information that's available to us from the surviving scripts and so forth, or the one remaining episode that we still have to watch. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I have anything else on this particular episode.
I've only got the one thing, which was I quite enjoyed the as I say, it was a well constructed episode, nicely directed, etc., etc. In particular, the scene where Beavis is entering the house and taking the shotgun to the sound of Terry Wogan on the radio was a really, really nice touch. I thought. I don't know whether that was in the script or whether it was just an improvised piece of direction, but it's the kind of incongruity you get of a psychopath grabbing a firearm while you get the kind of everyday background babble of someone as inane as Wogan as a DJ.
Well, I know vaguely who Terry Wogan is. I know him as a television personality. And then very little. I've seen clips of Wogan doing interviews with a few people, but I don't know enough about him that I didn't know that. I didn't recognize his voice
he's
on the radio.
Very recognizable.
It was actually, that was fairly well constructed from a directorial standpoint as well. Him skulking around. I didn't really notice it the rest of the episode, but the whole thing of seeing the kid, seeing through the door cracks and all that stuff was pretty well done. I was genuinely in doubt for the life of that woman and those kids.
Yes, yeah.
Through the episode. So, yeah, well done there. All right, well, next time when we get around to Doomwatch, we skip some more, and it is the never aired episode of Doomwatch, if I am not mistaken.
Sex and violence.
Sex and violence.
Doing
yes.
Sex and violence, and you're right. It's survived, but it was never broadcast, which is intriguing.
So we'll see if it was never broadcast because it's just so bad no one would want to watch it, or if it's something that's so bad Mary Whitehouse wouldn't want you watching.
Well, I think I'm sure there is a story behind it, but we'll get to that next time.
Indeed. Simon, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure, as always.
Listeners, I do hope you'll join us all again next time on Fusion Patrol. You've been listening to Fusion Patrol, a listener-supported podcast. Find out how you can be a sponsor and get early access to all episodes and more at patreon.com/Fusion Patrol. Come join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter. All episodes are available at FusionPatrol.com. Our music is Fight the Future by Amber Wolf. This has been a Lone Locust production.